To keep our episodes focused on our experts and the value that they bring to these conversations, we're supplementing them with some deep dives. These additional episodes may consist of conversations between Tim and Alyssa that deserve to be heard in full, or may highlight even more insight from our expert guests.
A recurring theme in our interviews with mental health professionals was the culture of perfectionism that exists within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and how it contributes to an environment where abuse is difficult to confront. In LDS doctrine, members are not only encouraged to become perfected through Jesus Christ and his gospel, but are taught that they can ultimately become like him, as he is, literally perfect. And though these teachings are technically about perfection being achieved in celestial life that comes after death, this ideal filters down into daily life, where righteousness is often measured both consciously and subconsciously by outward appearance, modest clothing, cheerful demeanor, and the light of Christ visible in one's countenance. At its most extreme, this emphasis can breed scrupulosity, a form of religious obsessive-compulsive behavior where individuals become too preoccupied with avoiding sin and keeping the commandments. And in a culture where anything that suggests brokenness or discomfort threatens the appearance of spiritual success, members often avoid acknowledging difficult realities. For victims of abuse, this creates a painful bind. Without a framework for discussing imperfection or harm, many remain silent, afraid that speaking out would mark them as flawed or worse, unworthy.
And why did his neighbor decide to investigate the church? The neighbor said, "If any other neighbor had have come to my door to invite me to investigate religion, I would have declined. But we have been so impressed with your family, your cleanliness, and your actions. You are always friendly and smiling. Your yard looks so neat and clean, and you're working in your yard before anyone else is out of bed in the mornings. We wanted to learn more about you and your church."
I think what sets Mormonism apart from other religion and even other Christian religions or any other religion you might encounter within the United States is I think Mormonism is exceptionally focused on appearances and on perfectionism and on how you look when you show up to church on Sunday. If you recall, when you asked me, how is your family devout, what I led with was where we sat within the church congregation. And that has nothing to do with my spiritual connection with a God and everything to do with how we showed our righteousness to the people around us.
When we know who we are, children of God, and understand that our outward appearance affects our inward spirituality and ultimately our behavior, we show respect for God, for ourselves, and for those around us by being modest in dress and behavior. Ultimately, how we dress will greatly influence our obedience to commandments and devotion to covenants. Dressing modestly will guide our attitudes and behaviors as we conduct our daily lives. In time, our dress may even determine who our friends and associates may be, thus influencing whether we live worthy of enjoying the blessings of happiness in this world and for eternity.
And I think that kind of is, in a nutshell, is how Mormonism is different and why a Mormon culture within somewhere like Utah is different than a lot of other religious cultures, is that really heavy focus on what it looks like to be a good Mormon creates this sheen of people focusing on appearances instead of on personal commitments to a God or to their family. There are also a lot of scriptures and songs and just messages about how your righteousness shows through your countenance. And so not just what you do, but just how you look.
By the way you live the gospel, you reflect his light. It is the daily, consistent things you do that will strengthen you to be a leader and an example. Daily prayer, daily scripture study, daily obedience. As you do these things, you will grow closer to the Savior and become more and more like him. Your face will glow with the fire of your faith. Have ye received his image in your countenance?
One of the number one comments I get on the videos I make is that she looked so much happier on her mission. She looked so much happier when she was, younger and active. And people will use specifically the word countenance as a way to discredit me. That something in the way I look is proof that I'm no longer close to God. And I think that the willingness to embrace the parts of Mormon society that look good, and I think feeds into even Mormon missionaries going out and as a missionary, so much of my training was about how to look nice, how to dress well, what types of blazers to put on, how to wear my earrings, what types of earrings. If they were too long and dangly, they weren't good for a Mormon sister missionary. So I think that all of this just said that whatever is going on internally, as long as you are looking the part, playing the part, putting the smile on your face and turning that frown upside down, and when appearance is attached to, and perfectionism is attached to purity and righteousness and connection with God, it really creates a bad backwards incentive, because everything's about appearances. And if everything is about appearances, then ultimately there can be a lot of bad in a community while everything still looks very nice. Yeah, I think along with the countenance question, the interesting thing is anyone who isn't a member of the church will always say, I look so much happier. And anyone who is a member will always say, she looks so much darker. So it's very interesting for people to watch the same piece of media, same face, presented on screen, and yet to draw such drastically different conclusions based off of what they perceive about me and my worthiness or my, activity within the church. And I think that what it looks like to be a Mormon is very multifaceted. I think the church loves to claim they're a global church, and so Mormons don't look any certain way because we have people who are popular, members in every country, and of course that is their usual response to that type of claim. Obviously, typically, I'm speaking about Utah Mormons specifically. I have Mormonism in my bloodline back through Joseph Smith, basically, and people always say I look really Mormon. I do. I know that about myself, but I think that it's white, it's thin, it's blonde, and I think a lot of times you see in Utah people going and paying a lot of money and going to great lengths to get that look, even if they weren't born with it. So I think to some extent, it's not just a genetic thing, because a lot of Mormon pioneers were from Scandinavia. That is a piece of the history that's proven. Just there's a large bloodline coming through Scandinavia. A lot of people converted over there and came to Utah. So that is to some extent just scientifically, genetically true. But I also think that makes it so that there is a very high standard for expectation for what you should look like as a member of the church, specifically in Utah. And I think that feeds eating disorders. I think that feeds into, cosmetic procedures, diet culture, hair culture, getting your hair dyed, extensions. I think I looked at Google search terms because it shows the volume of searches within different states, and Utah is highest for boob job. Lots of people Googling, how do I get a boob job out here? So I think that all of those things, it does feed back into this path of there's a straight and narrow path. There's one right way to be. You can be perfect. Mormons believe they will someday be perfect. And so all of that is not just spiritually perfect, but it also needs to be present in my countenance. I need to look perfect. I read in a book, she said that Mormons' eyes are bright but not deep. And I felt like that was kind of like a perfect description of what it is to be a member, where you're very bright and cheery and happy, but often unable to cope or talk or speak to really deep, complex issues because your mind is really just filtering everything through a Mormon lens.
Both Dr. Julie Hanks and Dr. Stephen Hassan, who we heard from in episode 3, spoke about this subject. Not only the culture of perfectionism that exists within the church, but the way it manifests in LDS communities and the way it manifests psychologically.
What kind of impact does that doctrine and kind of theology have on people's mental health in your experience?
Yeah, from my practice, that's a huge issue, right? So for women, it tends to be more physical appearance oriented and family appearance. And in general, it seems like for men, it's more church callings and how much money you make and the prestige of your career. And so that can just be an avenue that perfectionism is directed toward. And I think as a culture, we've kind of interpreted be therefore perfect as be ye therefore externally flawless. Look good, like have your kids look the part. And my understanding of that scripture is be therefore complete and whole. And that's different than flawless, right? And so perfectionism is something that I've seen in my practice so frequently. And I do think that misinterpretation of the doctrine is a huge plays a huge part in that.
How do you think perfectionism might play a role in downplaying or hiding events that are like abuse?
Yeah, I think in addition to perfectionism, it's not wanting to rock the boat, not wanting to have conflict, not wanting to hurt other people. And so I think sometimes victims don't get the help they need or the support they need because it's like we want to make the perpetrator feel okay. Like we don't want to hurt that family. We don't want to, right? And we want to keep this appearance that everything is going well. The appearance is kind of tied to like, we're going to prove that we're righteous. And if abuse is happening in our family or in our neighborhood or our ward, that makes us look like, looks like something is wrong because something is wrong, but that's not okay. And that's somehow tied to like, so that must mean we're not righteous.
For verily, verily, I say unto you, he that hath the spirit of contention is not of me, but is of the devil, who is the father of contention. And he stirreth up the hearts of men to contend with anger, one with another. Behold, this is not my doctrine, to stir up the hearts of men with anger one against another, but this is my doctrine, that such things should be done away. This means that Satan has power over us only when we let him in. We have agency. We can choose our behavior.
I think it brings me back to what I said about how Mormons, I think, in my opinion, have eyes that are bright but not deep. Because I think that often this idea that you shouldn't have contention, you shouldn't have any struggle almost, you should only be focused on bright and happy things, keeps people from pursuing problems or questions in their lives and fixing them or even addressing them when they do become deep and difficult and contentious.
Before you say an angry word, remember you'll regret it. For once it's said, the harm is done, and some folks won't forget it. Just hum your favorite hymn, sing out with vigor and vim, and you will find it clears your mind. Hum your favorite hymn.
So what you described is exactly what's taught in the Moonies, Scientology. It's this notion that either there's a thought that's in dissonance to the dogma or the doctrine or the hierarchy, or there's a feeling. Either one, we're trained to do thought stopping, which is maybe a prayer, a song, a meditation, an affirmation, a chant, whatever. In the Moonies, if I had a feeling or a thought that was negative to the, Father Moon, I would say, crush Satan, glory to heaven, peace on earth, glory to heaven, peace on earth, over and over and over again until I got rid of that. And likewise, feelings.
My experience with so many of the LDS that I deal with that are, in these cases, most of whom are really kind, decent, nice people who would give you the shirt off their back, but you're suing their church, God's true church. When it comes to defending this church, they don't want to get sideways with the church.
I think in a lot of cases, they respect the authority of the church so much more than the legal system that they're being held accountable to, potentially.
The next voice you'll hear is that of therapist Natasha Helfer. Her work will become the focus of future episodes, but during our interview with her, she said something that really applies to this subject.
I have been doing a lot of study into this idea of, is religion a protective factor or a harming factor in people's lives? And that's kind of language we use in scientific journals, is like, where are there protective factors and where are there harmful factors? And the answer with religion in general is kind of, it's a mixed bag. And actually, a lot of the research shows that people who have religion or spiritual communities or whatever actually do better. It serves as a protective factor. However, I don't think that many of those studies have done a good job of delineating what kind of religion we're talking about. And there's different types of religion, right? So you've got very kind of liberal religions like Unitarianism or Reformed Judaism, where there's a lot of flexibility in how you can live your life and what kinds of things you can do, including who you can love and when you have sex. And that doesn't, like ostracize you from the community. It's not like you now can't call yourself, a practicing or a believing member of their community because of these things. And then you have, very fundamental parts of religion, like, the Amish and the FLDS and the Mennonites and Benedictine monks, where they almost have to remove themselves from mainstream culture to be seen as active and a member of their communities. And if they reject anything, they're very ostracized, to the point that, like in the Amish community, you can't even be in contact with your family anymore. So I would imagine that the mental health of religious people also has to fluctuate tremendously depending on the flexibility versus the rigidity of the system. Now, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, as is colloquially known, they trend to be deemed, they've in this book called Acts of Faith by Stark and Fink, they were put into the category of strict or ultra strict. So there was cult. They didn't call it cult. They called it, what did they call it? I think they called it fundamental or something like that. And then there was ultra strict and there was strict. And then it started the three categories of more liberal religions. Well, so just to give you an idea, under strict, there was like Catholics, like Baptists, things like that. Ultra strict was the LDS, Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, like the Scientologists. And then, of course, the fundamental was like Amish, Mennonite, those kind of FLDS. So what we do have a little bit of research on, is that the stricter it is, the stricter of a tradition you come from, the more mental health ramifications there are when you don't fit the group. And especially if you leave the group, it's a harder process for you. But it's super interesting to see how, especially here in Utah, anytime there's, like, we've had the fight about, is depression because of Mormon land, is depression due to high altitude? Is the LGBTQ youth on the street, are they being kicked out by families, because they're gay, or are we just a super loving, protective factor for gay people? I mean, we have studies, especially coming out of BYU or done by people that, again, there's two biases I'm concerned about with these studies. One is the bias of the researchers, and two is the bias of the intended audience, because there was a study not too long ago that showed that the LDS Church is a protective factor for LGBTQ youth. And you can imagine all of us who are working with LGBTQ youth and see all the issues, we're all like, what? That can't be completely true. So you have to kind of take these studies and see, who have they studied, how many people, who was their target audience, why did they answer the ways they do? Because again, if I put myself in the role of a more believing, active LDS woman, I would have answered studies saying things like, I am a feminist, I am not suppressed as a Mormon woman, I have every opportunity as a Mormon woman to speak and to be a leader. And now I'd be like, I was absolutely suppressed as a Mormon woman, right? It's kind of ridiculous, but I would have answered those questions very differently under that worldview. So it's a complicated thing. So let me give you my answer that isn't always completely supported by research, and I'm aware of this, is I do think that there is a correlation between high levels of depression here in the state of Utah and perfectionism, which, again, they just came out with a study out of BYU that I haven't found in any good research. It wasn't published in a place where I would respect it. where they said perfectionism is not higher in LDS folks. And that's another one where I'm like, BS. Anyway, but so I do think depression is higher in the state of Utah due to its correlation with Mormon practice, which is very much behaviorally driven. And you have to prove your worthiness, and that's actually language that we use, right? You have to, are you worthy or are you unworthy, right? Which is very different from my evangelical Black friends in Kansas. It would be like, hell yeah, I'm unworthy and I need Jesus, right? There's an empowerment to that type of humility that we're not talking about in LDS land, right? And LDS land is like, oh no, I'm unworthy. I need to get worthy, and I need to do that by next week for this bishop's interview if I'm going to make it to the temple to get married or to do all the things that I need to do. So I do think there's a correlation there, and I do think there's a correlation with suicide, and I do think that there's a correlation with LGBTQ youth on our streets directly due to LDS doctrine and practice and the cultural phenomenons that are happening in this state. Yes.